everyone, Rosie here. Welcome back to my channel. It's time to talk about all of the books I read in October, which was, for me, a lot of books. I had what I think was a pretty ambitious TBR of, I want to say there was 9 books on my TBR. I can't remember and I can't be bothered to check. But I felt like, okay, that's a stretch goal. It's gonna be a challenge to read all of these, and then, you know, a surprise buddy read came up, and I was doing a bit of mood reading, and all of a sudden there was a lot more than 9 books that I read this month. So let's dive right into this. The first book that I finished in October was Soulless by Gail Carriger. This is a steampunk paranormal mystery romance, and I think you could put those words in sort of any order and have it apply. I love it, it's great. I did a whole video about it, which will be linked up here, but basically it's a heartwarming, adorable, happy-making story for me, and it was such a fun read. And also does have werewolves and vampires and paranormal, so like, was mildly spooky. The second book that I finished in October was The Mercies by Kiran, Millwood, Hargrave, and looking back at my notes now, I should have done a full book review for this one because I have a lot to say, so hopefully I will not ramble for too long about this, and if I do, I apologize. I'll try and put timestamps down below so you can skip if you don't want to hear about it, but you should hear about this one because I am so excited about it. The Mercies is set in a tiny village in the far north of Norway in the early 1600s when witch hunting is at its peak and concern about the interplay between Christianity and the local Sami shamanistic religion is at its peak. This story starts when all of the men and not very young boys in the village are out fishing on Christmas Eve, and a freak storm arises, leading them all to drown. So all of a sudden this community of women has to cope on their own for the first time. It sort of says there had been widows before, but there had never been an entire village of widows. Just as they're starting to figure out how to manage, I think it's 6 months or a year after the storm, the king sends a witch hunter to this town to root out any traces of witchcraft. This book is equally about dealing with the loss of so many people and what happens when everyone loses their husband and their brother and their sons and all of this and how people cope with that. And it's also about the effect that this literal witch hunt is having on the town and how people react to that. So it was fascinating. It's also historical fiction that was written very differently to most historical fiction that I think I've read before. The only way I can describe the writing was sparse and frank. It doesn't try and pretend that the past wasn't cold and smelly and dirty and cramped and unpleasant in times, which I didn't realize how much I would appreciate until I read this, but it added so much atmosphere and it made everything feel so much more like you're really seeing from this character's perspective, to hear not just about the big level concerns but also the small level discomfort concerns. I also really adored this approach to writing women. We see from multiple women's perspectives, so we get nuanced takes on things. We don't only get one experience, which is automatically a benefit, right? When you can see how different people react to the same sort of situation. I also really appreciate how even with the women who aren't totally ready to accept the role that's laid out for them as women in the 1600s, they don't get some sort of magical modern feminist fairy who like lets them out of those restrictions. They can fight against them and not really believe in them and wish that they could do something differently, but they are still bound by the reality of their time, which gave it a very harsh but real feeling. There was nothing about this book that tried to sugarcoat the situation. As for the plot, it's simultaneously a book in which nothing much really happens in terms of major events, but at the same time it's filled with this mounting tension and suspense that feels incredibly horrifying because all of that element comes from incredibly mundane, grounded in the real world things. It's very much a suspense and a tension that's rooted in psychological horror thriller. It's not a horror or a thriller, I don't think, but it had that feeling of like mounting dread, but from purely human, real actions, which I found really effective. I said in my TBR that I thought it had witchcraft elements, and it does, but more in Salem witch trial elements, not so much actual people doing witchcraft that affects the story elements. I also said that I thought there might be a female-female romance element, which there is, and it's super interesting, and I found it super well written. But it's not a female-female romance book, it's a book with an element of that, so don't go to this looking for a lesbian love story, but it was a nice added interesting element to the book. I will say there are a few, like, trigger warnings, I guess, that I would give. There's definitely multiple descriptions of rape scenes, there's emotional abuse of a spouse, and there's a description of a miscarriage. So if those are things that bother you, they're not, like, huge elements of the plot, but beware that they're there. The next book I finished was Spook, Science Tackles the Afterlife by Mary Roach, and I listened to this one as an audiobook. It is, as the title would suggest, a scientific look at the afterlife. Not what happens to our bodies after we die, but what happens to our souls or our usness. Mary Roach looks at everything from historical science, so like experiments in the 19th century to see if they could weigh souls, to modern science. She visits, I think, an engineer who's has a theory that particular like noise frequencies can make us experience hauntings. So she travels all over the place and meets with all sorts of people who are working on this. She's very involved with this. She goes to a seminar for mediums. She's part of an experiment where a scientist is trying to induce hauntings with, I think, electromagnetic waves or something. It's been a while since I read it now. Due to the nature of the book, it's not a super in-depth look at any one field of science or one area of study, but it was an interesting look at this topic, which I really didn't know very much about. I wouldn't want to read an in-depth book on any of these subjects anyways, probably, so I'm just as happy to read a shorter survey-type book. I will say the audiobook narration had a questionable choice, in my view, to imitate some accents, which, to be fair, was done for basically everyone who was speaking, but it just really didn't feel necessary. You can just tell me what someone said. You don't have to, you know, do a bad Indian accent imitation to give me a vibe. I get the vibe from what they're saying. This is a book that I don't know if I would have enjoyed it enough to sit down and read it, but it was enjoyable to listen to, and I did have fun with it. The next book I finished was The Fellowship of the Ring by J R Tolkien, which I read for the Tolkien Along. Something that really struck me with this reading is the obstacles in their path are not just servants of the enemy strategically placed to make them fight or divert. There are obstacles in the sense that they don't really know how they're going to accomplish what they've set out to do. I'd never really thought about that before, but I really enjoyed it this time around. I also read The Case of the Missing Men by Kris Bertin with art by Alexander Forbes. This is the story of a teen detective club in a small town on the east coast of Canada who find themselves involved in a much, much bigger mystery than they expect. I wasn't sure when I put this on my TBR if this was going to be cozy or spooky, and it was definitely on the spooky side. Despite the Nancy Drew art style, this was not a kiddie mystery. There was genuine suspense, it was genuinely creepy and mysterious, and throughout the book, the art is worked in a way to be both that like cute teen detective club art style and also genuinely creepy. So on the whole, this really pulled me in. It was engaging, it was interesting, the suspense built throughout the book so that you wanted to keep reading, and I found the mystery really interesting. However, there were a couple elements that I wasn't so sure about. The fact that there are so many characters combined with the art style and the fact that it's very art heavy as opposed to text heavy made it sort of hard to keep track. That was sort of confusing at times. It didn't hinder my reading of the story or anything, but sometimes you're sort of unclear of like, wait, who even is this? Have we met this person before? How are they involved? And the other point where again it just wasn't totally clear is there would be jumps in time, but they wouldn't necessarily always be marked. And I actually went back a few times and checked like the beginning of the chapter to see if it said, you know, 1 week earlier or 3 days earlier or anything like that. And I feel like it did sometimes, but not always. So I'd read a chapter and then just sort of start the next one and be like, wait, where are we and what's going on? Not in a, the mystery is suspenseful and we're unclear about what's happening there, but just in like, in this timeline, wait, how did we go from here to here sense? Despite that, it was fun, I enjoyed it, and I definitely want to pick up the sequel. One of the additions to my TBR this month was Bringing Down the Duke by Evie Dunmore. I saw that Lana from Lana Ex Libris and Crystal from Crystal's Bookish Life were doing a buddy read for it and joined them. It's a historical romance, which is not a genre I've really read before, and I'm not sure how I feel about it. Bringing Down the Duke is the story of 25-year-old Annabelle, a scholar who wins a scholarship to study at the First Ladies' College at Oxford. But one of the conditions of her scholarship is that she has to help the organization giving it to her fight for women's suffrage. In the course of her work with the organization, she meets Sebastian, who is a powerful, conservative, and incredibly cold duke, and of course the love interest. When I first finished reading this, I thought it was fun but not amazing. I wasn't in love with it, but also I was sort of like, yeah, that was a fun read, but I didn't really think much about it. And I'm so glad that I did it as a buddy read, because talking to them, it made me think about it so much more than I had just reading it, and realized that I really didn't like it that much. I feel like there were all sorts of issues with characterization and storylines and stuff like that that my brain just seemed to not notice when I was reading, and honestly the whole experience has sort of made me question if I'm way too generous to the books I read. I don't think so, but maybe I should do more buddy reads. Let me know if you would like to do a buddy read. After that, I did a really big switch of gears and read Samskara, A Rite for a Dead Man by U R Ananthamurthy. This is set in a small community of Brahmins in South India, and the story starts with a man dying. And he hasn't lived according to the strict religious code that as a Brahmin he was supposed to follow. But he also was never officially excommunicated by his community. So the rest of the community is left with this debate, like, what do we do with his body? He didn't live according to our codes, so would it be, like, I guess, impure for us to do his funeral rites? But on the other hand, he wasn't excommunicated, so he is a Brahmin, so we can't let anyone else do his funeral rites. As they're trying to make a decision and scheming and trying to see if they can get someone else to take responsibility for this, the body is lying in his house, decomposing. Then rats start turning up dead in huge quantities, and then people start dying of a fever. I really enjoyed the story in this, and I really enjoyed the world, but I feel like the philosophical side of this was completely wasted on me. I didn't get it. And that's not the book's fault. I don't know if it's my fault. I think it was interesting to read, but I wasn't getting much more out of it. I could tell that there was more there, but I wasn't getting it. Part of that may have been because this book feels like the book form of culture shock. It was so completely a different setting and set of things that it assumes you know. Even with the notes in my translated edition, I felt like I was missing so much of the cultural context, which that was challenging, but it was also kind of a good experience to be reminded that as someone who's from a Western Anglophone country, I'm so used to reading books that are written in the cultural context that I'm familiar with. And it's really nice, even if it's hard, to read books that don't fit into that mold. On the whole, this wasn't my favorite book. It wasn't bad. I didn't love it. The next book I finished was The Visitors by Catherine Burns. This is a horror/thriller novel, theoretically, about a very, very naive spinster who's trying to ignore what her brother is doing in the basement of their childhood home. I did a whole reading vlog/review of this book, which I will link up above, but if you would like to skip that video, the short answer is wasn't that horrifying, wasn't that thrilling. After that, I was keen to get to something I knew I would love, so I read Reaper Man by Terry Pratchett. This is the second book in the Death subseries, and in this one, the auditors of the universe decide that Death has developed too much of a personality, and he's become too attached to humanity, so they're going to replace him. All of a sudden, for the first time ever in, eons and eons and eons, Death finds himself mortal, and as a result of being mortal, he finds himself alive and able to experience life. He actually accepts the firing from the position of death pretty well and sort of says, okay, well, I'm gonna go off and live my life and finds a job bringing in a little old lady's harvest, sort of leaves the whole death business behind. But of course, without death to guide souls to their afterlife, all of that life energy starts to build up. People are dying, but their souls or their life energy or whatever you want to call it isn't going anywhere. All of this life is building up and it's building up and it's causing poltergeist-like actions, which, as in most Discworld books, I feel like, has consequences for the fabric of reality. As is so often the case with Pratchett, this book about death is really just as much a book about life and what that means, and I loved it. I'm sure you're not surprised. I love every Pratchett book that I read, and this was no exception. Once again, it had been ages since I read this one, and I absolutely adored rereading it. The next book I finished reading was Central Station by Lavie Tidhar. This is a science fiction look at humanity, I guess. I have a whole fairly long review in which I go into depth about my thoughts about this book, so I'll link that up above. It's a collaboration with Emerita by the Book, so you should also check out her video about the Lavie Tidhar book that she read this month, which was by Force Alone. I will link that down below as well. Towards the end of October, I was going through not exactly a reading slump, but just like an emotional slump. And I really wanted to read something super comforting, so I picked up Cocaine Blues by Kerry Greenwood. This is the first Phryne Fisher novel. Her acquaintance believes that her daughter's being poisoned, so she travels to Australia to figure out what's going on there. Along the way, she befriends communist cab drivers. She hires a maid who's been thrown out without a reference because her employer's son tried to rape her and then blamed her. She also decides that if the police can't take down an illegal abortionist who's killing women, then she'll do it herself. Honestly, I just love this book. I love Phryne's character. I didn't realize until this reading that this was first published in the mid-80s, which honestly makes me love her character even more. I love the descriptions of Phryne's clothes, and I cannot in any way give a fair or unbiased review of this book. The ultimate comfort reread. It ticks all the boxes, it pushes every button for happy chemicals in my brain, and I just enjoy it so much. I will say it's more... gritty's not the right word for this book whatsoever, but it's the only word I can think of than I remembered. And there are, I would say, mild content warnings for mentioned sexual assault and, you know, discussion of backstreet abortions and stuff like that. Then the next book I finished was Flying Too High, also by Kerry Greenwood, the second Phryne Fisher novel. In this one we have an abducted child and a man who, despite all the evidence pointing towards it, did not kill his father. Again, how can I evaluate this? I mean, this is a book in which Phryne walks on the wings of a flying airplane, poses for an erotic sculpture, and while doing all of this still manages to outwit a police detective without him even noticing he's been outwitted. I even enjoyed the scenes that are from the POV of the little girl who's been kidnapped. Usually I hate child POV scenes, but these ones, like I said, like, they are designed to delight me, and they do. One thing I noticed with this one reading it through, though, is there's some timeline confusion. I think Kerry Greenwood wanted to introduce the kidnapping plot from the beginning of the book, but I think it means that we're sort of jumping through time without referencing that we're jumping through time. At least that's the only way I can make things line up in my head. But you know what? That's such a small detail, I don't even care. It was a delight. The last book I finished in October was The Faceless Old Woman Who Secretly Lives in Your Home by Joseph Fink and Jeffrey Cranor. This is the third novel set in the Night Vale universe. And this one is the story of the faceless old woman before she came to Night Vale and before she was an old woman with no face. Her history is interspersed with glimpses at what she's doing in Night Vale in the present. This sold itself as an epic tale of betrayal and revenge, and it did not let me down on that front. There were a lot of plot twists in this that I was not expecting whatsoever when I first read them, but then when I thought back over the events that led up to them, made total sense. And the bits that were set in modern day Night Vale were so interesting as well, because at first they read as this would feel like a horror story if I was seeing it from not her perspective, but because I'm seeing it from her perspective it's just kind of funny. And then they got more and more horrifying as time went on, and as the implications of what she was doing became more clear. So interestingly written. I feel sort of contradictory saying this given my review of Central Station, but I really appreciate that there are threads to the world that are sort of woven lightly through this story, but we don't get any sort of resolution on. They're in the background. The faceless old woman doesn't know what's really going on with them and she never figures it out, so we also don't know. I think the reason it works in this book where it didn't work for me in Central Station is the woman is actually taking actions and trying to move. So we see her working towards goals and we see her making decisions and taking action and working towards things. We just don't really know what state of the world she's in. I don't know if I can say objectively if this was a good book, but I did enjoy the writing, the plot drew me in, I liked the characters, I enjoyed the world building. It was a fun read. And here ends the wrap up. That was, for those of you who are interested in keeping count at home, 13 books in October, which is a lot for me. I'm not usually someone who reads that many books in a month, but I'm not going to complain about it. If you have read any of these, let me know down below. What did you think of them? Do you agree? Do you disagree? And let me know about what you loved reading in October. If you liked this video, please hit the like button down below. If you would like to see more of my videos, please hit subscribe, and thank you for watching.